Good morning, and welcome to the Sunday morning at the Marxist Library, coming from Oakland, California. We've been doing these programs on public affairs, theory, and political events for around 15 years, attempting to keep the movement informed and the population informed from a Marxist perspective, which is really necessary for the working class and the masses to really move forward. Last week we had a successful hybrid session here at the Marxist Library, Nebo Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland. But there were some glitches and problems that showed up we need to work on. So our previously planned hybrid program for this week has been replaced, and we thank Robert Ovitz for his previous agreement to speak at the Marxist Library, and we will schedule him sometime in the future. But today, we're addressing a very important topic: the question of China and China-U.S. relations, particularly in the framework or on the focusing on Nancy Pelosi's trip, what I call her escapade to China. And we have three speakers today. The first is David Ewing, who is the chair of the San Francisco chapter of the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. David is an attorney specializing in service to the Chinese community in San Francisco. Second speaker is Jean Ruyle, who most of you are regulars familiar with. He's was a long-time anthropology professor and a leader of the Veterans for Peace. And finally, Raj Sahai, who is an activist and scholar, Marxist scholar. So they each will speak for about 20 minutes, more or less, and then afterwards we'll have a question and answer period. So I'd like to call on Dave Ewing first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Can I go 20 minutes? I'm going to see what I can do. I thought maybe I would, I think knowing some background about the Taiwan-China relationship, some of the history might be helpful for people, and I know people here are pretty well informed and know a lot about it, but I thought I would just mention some of the early relations between China and Taiwan, which have been impacted more by Japan than the U.S. until World War II. The Great Pacific Power before the Japan's defeat in World War II, of course, was Japan, and Japan occupied Taiwan, took it from China and occupied it, beginning around in their. I think the war was the Sino-Japanese War was in 1895, but there had been Japanese attacks on Taiwan before that, triggered by an odd event. Around 1890, indigenous people on the island of Taiwan, and there have been indigenous people on Taiwan for 3,000 years or so, but indigenous people on the southern tip of the island attacked a Japanese merchant vessel and captured all the goods and killed a lot of the crew. And so Japan, in the early 1890s, they demanded that China pay for the losses, make good on everything, all the damage that was done, because of course Taiwan is part of China, and it's, you know, so they held China responsible for that loss of shipping. China said, well, you know, well, we're sorry about all this. Yeah, Taiwan's part of China, but this was done by indigenous people on the island. It was not our soldiers, not our Navy or our Army that attacked you from Taiwan. It was indigenous people, and we have no control over them. And we're not really responsible. So that was enough for the Japanese to, there's a series of contentious back and forth, smaller military clashes. But by 1895, Japan had conquered the whole island. And all during this period, all the, you know, the Chinese off islands, the Diaoyu Islands that Japan calls Senkaku, all the other, you know, many other islands that were part of China were occupied steadily by Japan. And then, of course, historically, there were not really any, there hadn't been any challenges to Chinese sovereignty over these islands. It was pretty much recognized, certainly by the United States, that these, the Taiwan and the island chains that Japan occupied between World War I and World War II, that those were, of course, part of Chinese territory. And then World War II ended. I think World War II ended, was it today or tomorrow? That anyway, that Japan surrendered August 8th, I think, 1945. And then there was a conference, a United Nations conference held in San Francisco at the end of World War II to assess Japanese territorial conquests and, you know, decide what would happen to the territory Japan had held. And at the conference, the U.S. was pretty active in demanding that the Chinese territories occupied by Japan, including Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands and the others, all must return to China. And so there was, within this early United Nations type meeting. Remember, the United Nations was formed during World War II, the coalition against the fascist powers. But anyway, there was this, wide support for China. Of course, China was controlled by the Kuomintang men. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of China. So it was, he was, one of the big five war powers, in part of the coalition against the fascist powers. So the U.S. was happy to support the return of Chinese territory to their ally, Chiang Kai-shek. Then, of course, the Civil War broke out. Chiang Kai-shek was very unpopular. He was hated in China because of the immense corruption led to famines and extraordinary price inflation after the war. People could not get relief because the government was controlled by, a handful of bureaucrat capitalists who were tied in with the Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. So there was widespread support for the communists, who people also recognized were the heroes of the war against Japan. They had done their armies had done most of the actual fighting, and they achieved most of the victories against the Japanese forces. So they had reputation for honesty. And of course, the American State Department observers who were in China during the war to help trying to fight, part of the US aid program to help trying to fight Japan, they were kind of won over to Mao's side because they had seen so much of the corruption. So although the American ambassador was hostile to Chinese communists, many of the State Department people on the ground who had contact with both sides, and General Stilwell and others, the American commanders, they were sympathetic, more sympathetic to Mao because of the honesty and the obvious mass popular support he had. So this was just terrific. This was a complicated mix of politics and military issues that were in play at the time of the Chinese Revolution. So after the Chinese Revolution ended in 1949, the U.S. now had, the Kuomintang Party was left to it, the army. The U.S. helped Chiang Kai-shek escape to the island of Taiwan, and the U.S. Navy prevented any crossing by the Chinese army to complete the liberation of China. And so that's the kind of the basis for that. And though Japan had been the great imperial power up until its defeat in World War II, now after that defeat, the United States became the great imperial power. And although I think U.S. Diplomacy toward the U.S. was not 100% on board with the Kuomintang on the island, Taiwan. They were worried about the corruption. One of the first things that the Kuomintang had to do when they occupied the island was they had to deal with those pesky indigenous people who had created problems for the Japanese before. So they massacred them. They killed they just massacred like a genocide of about 30,000 indigenous people, and that pretty much shut down the indigenous resistance. So that was something that was an embarrassment, I think, to the U.S. to some degree, and the U.S. So the U.S. was kind of was willing to support Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan, but not that enthusiastic until the Korean War began. And with the beginning of the Korean War and the anti-communism in the United States, U.S. policy strongly shifted towards Taiwan and remained that way for a long time until finally, China became strong enough after the revolution in 1979. The U.S. felt compelled to recognize China, and that diplomatic recognition led to China's having a seat in the United Nations, even on the Security Council now. So there was that long period. So the deal that the U.S. managed to reach with China was that, of course, the U.S. recognized that Taiwan was part of China. This wasn't such a hard issue at the time because Chiang Kai-shek had always insisted that Taiwan was part of China. It's never been an issue. In the Taiwan legislature, people from all the provinces of China had a representative who appeared representing their interests in the fake Taiwan legislature in Taipei on the island. And in each of his, while he lived, in each of his New Year's addresses, Chiang Kai-shek would usually promise that this is the year that we will reconquer the mainland and free the people of China, and the Kuomintang will again rule. It's kind of I don't know if people believed it, but it was kind of a silly promise, but he made that again and again. The repressive features of the regime changed slowly over time, especially after his death. And then his son liberalized things a little bit, although he did murder an American journalist, which caused some problems. But the U.S. has had this more difficult relation with China in recent years because of the power of the U.S. Navy keeps increasing in the Pacific. The U.S. has expanded. U.S. had under President Obama, the U.S. pivoted to Asia. The U.S. has been tied down in wars over oil in the Middle East, and now many of those wars have ended in defeat or withdrawal. And the pivot to Asia is a recognition that for the foreseeable future, it looks like the real dynamism in the world economy is coming from Asia, especially countries like China, India, Asian tigers, and those other places like Taiwan. So these are important economically for the future of world business and commerce. And so this, I think, is the reason for the U.S. pivot. And so the US has become more and more ambiguous about its promise to recognize Taiwan as part of China. And so we've seen this relationship become more difficult. Also, the Chinese socialism has been enormously successful, both socially with the immense popular support at home, and the rising conditions of cultural standards, economic standards for the masses of people in China, and just the growth of the economy and the ability of them to arm themselves and defend themselves. So China has become a much more important actor in the world, now the #2 economy in the world. It's many times larger than the Indian economy, actually. I think it's something like 5 times larger than the Indian economy, with about the same population as India. Although the Indian population will soon be larger than China's population by current estimates. Anyway, so the US now sees China as not just simply a source of a source of problem with communism, but also an economy that is large enough to have an impact in the US. And so there's a very strong, I think there's a somewhat rational fear among the US imperialists that China is growing very, very rapidly, may soon eclipse the US economically. And then, military power is often a function of economic power. So I think that, American military strategists are preparing for a confrontation with China. Because of the growth of the Chinese economy and the failures of the US economy, we have one country growing quickly, an economy that's productive. The US economy seems to be failing. There are many problems within the US. So, a rational militarist would want to attack now rather than later. So I think for US war planners, there's a sense of urgency about dealing with China. The longer they wait, the greater China's advantages will grow. And so striking sooner against China than later against China is a rational, from the point of view of a rational imperialist, that seems to be something that they have to take into consideration. So I think some of that explains the increasing pace of US pressure against China, more and more systems, attempts to build alliances, the AUKUS alliance, and then, trying to pull important economic actors like India, and if they can, but also pulling in Australia, maybe even little New Zealand, trying to bring allies to bear against China. And Japan, of course, remains an incredibly important actor. Americans often forget the role of Japan in the Pacific, which is still very strong. And, the murder of Abe and, his legacy, of course, is a rearmed Japan, perhaps even with nuclear weapons. We don't know. But there's a sense Japan faces the same problem with China, the same competition with China that the US does. And so I think for Japan, it's also, and Japan has those historic links with Taiwan, of course. There are people on Taiwan who are still strong, pro-Japan. Actually, during the war, some Japan recruited soldiers from the island of Taiwan to fight in their army against China. But anyway, these important geopolitical, the geopolitical shape of the Pacific Rim and the importance of the interplay between the major powers all suggest that the US is becoming, and maybe has become, more aggressive towards China. And so I think the pressure on Taiwan, the ambiguity of the American position on China and Taiwan, strengthens the hand of the US. It's a message to China that the US is moving in, and for China, the liberation of Taiwan, the freedom of Taiwan, is a decisive, important unfinished business from the Chinese Revolution. And China and Chinese people especially, not just the Chinese government, but if people have a chance to go to China and speak to Chinese people on the street, people are strongly determined to free Taiwan from the control of the capitalists on the island now. And they want to return Taiwan to China. At the same time, because the Chinese economy is so powerful, and the Taiwan economy has been very productive, even though it's a much smaller economy, there are extremely important economic ties between China and Taiwan, the island of Taiwan. So many businesses on Taiwan are connected to China. Young people, many young people, especially children of the more privileged entrepreneurial class, they go to China to make their fortunes. They don't make their fortunes in Taiwan. They move to China. There is a lot of Taiwanese investment in China. There's a tremendous, because people speak the same language, they speak Mandarin, there is a strong social ties and family ties. There's a tremendous amount of intermarriage between people in Taiwan and people on the mainland. So now we have, so there are families that are united. Taiwan, the people of Taiwan do not have an appetite for a war with China. I'm very strongly convinced of that from visiting both places. It's pretty, among young people, there is now relatively strong resistance to war. I wouldn't call the mood pacifist, but young people of draft age are against war. They're not interested in serving in the Taiwan Army. The Taiwan Army is starved of personnel now. Taiwan has a draft to try and, because that's the only way they can get people to join. There aren't volunteers for their army. But there is lots of resistance on Taiwan to the draft. So the draft in Taiwan is a 4-month commitment. Essentially, people are in the army for 4 months. They get trained in whatever their military training is supposed to be, and then they're in the reserves after that. So the Taiwan army is not a very effective army. It's not an army that wants to fight other Chinese people, and so much of the Taiwan military is run by contractors. People hired from overseas, especially the U.S., to operate the missile systems, fly the aircraft. There's a tremendous shortage of pilots in the Taiwan service. So there isn't an appetite for war. You wouldn't know that though, looking at the American news. You see the pro-Pelosi demonstrations on CNN while she was there, and with pretty tough rhetoric from the Taiwan leadership against China. So you wouldn't really know that, but it's a fact that Americans will probably come to learn sooner rather than later. But there isn't really an appetite for war, and that creates a problem for the Taiwan rulers. They have to, they put on a brave face of being aggressive, but they don't really have support, certainly not for war. There are differences of opinion, of course, in Taiwan. People do not want to be invaded, and I think there is a sense of avoiding a war as much as possible. And there's a sense that Taiwan people want to have control over, like people in Beijing want to have control over their futures. People in Taipei also want to have control over their futures. So their politics are mixed on the island. And, I think but there is a strain of a pro-unification politics that ebbs and flows, and, sometimes it's stronger, sometimes it's weaker, but it's there. And it's a changing political situation, and the party politics have shifted. They've shifted to the right recently. They can shift back the other way in future elections, depending on how things happen. I just want to say a little bit about the events of the past week, the military events of the past week. It's intolerable to China that U.S. would encourage an independent Taiwan. It's the U.S. in order for Taiwan to declare independence from China, it had to put on some kind of democratic face, had to show that it has popular or convince people there's popular support on the island for such a move. And so, U.S. Tried to portray Taiwan as some democratic country, not part of China, but a democratic country under Chinese pressure that wants to be independent and free from communism and so forth. To do that, the visits by American leaders are pretty important. So Nancy Pelosi's trip there shows the U.S. commitment towards moving China, pushing China back and moving Taiwan towards independence. I think that there isn't another way to really understand her trip, especially because the Chinese warned about it, complained about it. There's a lot of speculation in the American press that perhaps President Biden didn't approve the trip. All that we don't know for sure, but was a pretty aggressive trip. The Chinese warned them not to do it, and for the last week or so, China has been demonstrating its military power both to the United States and to Japan, and of course to the Taiwan authorities who rule the island now. So there had been a number of missile flyovers that landed in the sea, in the North China Sea, and some of the I think the Japanese authorities said that at least one of the missiles landed in their economic zone, their economic zone that they claim around Japan. And then there had been flyovers by aircraft and naval exercises all around the island. And effectively for the past 5 days or so, or 6 days, it's been an embargo. It's like a blockade. So ships are not able to pass through the Chinese ships. And it's a demonstration of Chinese concern, and they're demonstrating their ability to defend themselves if they have to. So I think that the military drills will end in a day or so. They're only for a limited time. These large military drills will end, and then we'll see how the U.S. reacts to what's happening in the region, and we have to worry about other players like Japan, especially, which is sounding much more aggressive, and of course the attempt to change the Japanese constitution to allow it to remilitarize. That looks like that's in the cards now. We'll have to see what happens with that. But it looks like Japan is really moving towards a much more aggressive military posture, which of course is directed against China. So I think that, I don't know how long I ran, maybe not my full 20 minutes, but I hope that's a useful summary for people. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next up is Eugene or Raj. Would you like to go ahead, Eugene?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave, for that history and current situation. It's really important and makes the rest of our tasks easier. But I want to start by reminding everybody that yesterday was August 6th, the 77th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And these were war crimes, but I think the real war crimes were yet to come, because the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not simply the end of World War II, but the start of the Cold War, as the US began to threaten nuclear attacks on its former ally, the Soviet Union, within a few months of the end of World War II. And so now, we have not only the threat of nuclear annihilation, climate change, pollution, inequality, the war in Ukraine, and just at a time when, everybody thinks the world can't handle any more messes, Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan. And we have to ask, did this make nuclear war less likely or more likely? And I've been trying to follow the international press on this from various countries, and no one thinks that this, postponed in any way. It brought nuclear war, made it even more likely. And as the saying goes, United States imperialism will fight Moscow to the last Ukrainian and fight China to the last Taiwanese. But I don't think Governor Tsai Ing-wen is as stupid as the person in Ukraine. So what I want to do is four things. First of all, give the Veterans for Peace position, both on China and on specifically that part of China, which we call Taiwan. Secondly, talk a little bit about the history of Mao's Communist Party of China and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, or KMT. If time permitted, I'll talk a little bit about the history of Taiwan and geopolitics. But let me start by reading you. We have two resolutions from Veterans for Peace that are relevant. The first was passed 2 years ago, Pivot to Peace with China and the World. And it reads as follows: whereas Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans and allies dedicated to building a culture of peace by using our experiences to inform the public of the true causes and enormous costs of wars, seeking to heal the wounds of wars and working to end all wars and hostilities between nations. And whereas the so-called pivot to Asia of 2011 was in fact a pivot toward war and confrontation that identified China as a competitor and adversary, carrying with it the threat of nuclear war. And whereas this dangerous policy has created palpable feelings of fear, animosity, and even hatred, not only toward the Communist Party of China, but toward the Chinese people in general, and Chinese American citizens and other Asian peoples in the United States. And whereas humanity now faces multiple crises which threaten the well-being and very survival of our species, crises which demand the cooperation of the two largest and most powerful countries, China and the United States. Therefore, be it resolved that Veterans for Peace urges the government of the United States to reject escalation towards global conflict and instead pursue peace, non-intervention, and cooperation with China and the rest of the world. And that was approved by the members of Veterans for Peace, but by over 99% majority. And the other one deals specifically with Taiwan. And it's going to be voted on in a few weeks at the convention. But it has been approved widely within Veterans for Peace. U.S. hands off Taiwan and the South China Sea. Whereas Taiwan and the South China Sea represent a key area where U.S. policy is likely to lead to nuclear war, whether by design or mistake. And whereas the de facto government of Taiwan calls itself the Republic of China, but is not officially recognized by the United Nations, the United States, Canada, Australia, NATO, nor over 90% of UN members, nor any nation in Asia. It exists solely because of the early military support by the United States before and after 1949, continuing to the present in various forms. US arms sales to Taiwan in 2020 alone amounted to over $5 billion. And whereas in the Shanghai communique of 1972 and others, President Nixon and Chairman Mao agreed that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China. And whereas the time when the US Navy patrolled the Yangtze River is over, the Eurocentric idea that Asian nations require the United States to defend them from themselves has no place in the 21st century. And whereas the People's Republic of China does not now, nor has it ever, threaten the territorial security or the people's well-being of the US, NATO, or any other country allied to the United States. Therefore, be it resolved that the Veterans for Peace urges the governments of the United States to withdraw all military and naval forces from the Straits of Taiwan and the South China Sea. Re-examine US arms sales to the ROC in Taiwan, and remember that the resolution of the status of Taiwan is the internal affair of the Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits, into which the United States has no right to intervene. Now, having said that, I think it's Taiwan is really a beautiful island. It's a great place to visit and to love. I have family there. My son married a Chinese woman from Taiwan, and they all made annual visits to Taiwan, and they love the place. They haven't been able to go since the pandemic, but they really have a great sense of identification with Taiwan because they have family and their grandparents there and all these other people. And but you know, when I talk to them, you know, when I say, well, you know, this is what's going on in here and so forth, and they kind of nod their heads and say, yeah, Grandpa, can we go back to, you know, studying for exams? I gotta, you know, they're in college now, so they have more important things to do. And, you know, I think it's important, curiously, that Taiwanese, from what I can gather, do not take this all that seriously. They're much more concerned what's going on in their island and things like that. And majority polls do not rate this as that great a thing for them. And I also want to say the closest point on the mainland is Pentan Island, which is about 77 miles from Taiwan across the straits. And people like to go there. You know, it's a very scenic spot. And they're looking there, they're taking pictures and so on. But now, instead of going there to take pictures of the scenery, they're looking at the sea, and they're taking pictures of these rockets going over towards across Taiwan, and helicopters flying over towards Taiwan. So again, it's almost like a tourist event for some people, both in Taiwan and China, and a lot of people just would rather get back to serious kinds of things. So that's one point. Another thing I just want to mention is I want to talk a little bit about the relations, because there's a long history of bad blood between Mao's Communist Party of China and Chiang Kai-shek's KMT, or Kuomintang, which goes back to the, you know, to the founding of Lenin's International Communist International, or Comintern, because Kuomintang was one of the original members of the International Comintern, because Lenin had great admiration for Sun Yat-sen as a great revolutionary leader. So that was incorporated into the original founding of the International. But then when Mao joined, Mao's Communist Party of China was organized and joined the International, then it was directed to work with Chiang Kai-shek. And this time, with Kuomintang. And at this time, Sun Yat-sen was still alive. And so the Kuomintang was actually a revolutionary force at that time when Mao and Chiang Kai-shek's forces worked together. They had great successes in terms of organizing the Chinese people. There was the Northern Expedition, which of 1927, which a great degree of organization of China went. But then in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek revealed his true nature as a fascist and attacked the communists, executed thousands of them throughout China, forced the war between Chiang Kai-shek, between Chiang Kai-shek's forces and the communists. They tried to exterminate all communists. So this war went on. The United States sent troops to support Chiang Kai-shek in this after World War II. The United States was defeated, Chiang Kai-shek was defeated, and the technical term here is a running dog, I think, the running dogs of imperialism, and they were forced to retreat to Taiwan. So, and then I have to say that since then, and Chiang Kai-shek instituted a reign of terror, the so-called White Terror, in Taiwan, I think in 1946. It was just really horrible what they did. It was martial law was there until the 1980s, and but after Chiang's death, I have to say that Taiwan has made giant steps towards instituting a much more humane society, and and I think that that the woman Tsai, in a way, is not as stupid, and she's not going to. I hope she does not play the same kinds of games that go on elsewhere. But I want to say that I won't go too much into the history of Taiwan Island, just other than to say that historically, it is in the last couple of centuries, it has either been a part of China or part of a hostile imperialist force. Japan on the one hand, and United States on the other. So I think we need to bear that in mind when we think about China. And I will stop there and turn it over to my good comrade, Raj. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My
Next
turn
speaker,
to, okay.
next speaker is Raj Sahai. Go ahead, Raj.
Okay, thank you. I will not go over the material that David and Jean has gone over. We all know the history of KMT, its brutality, its illegitimacy, and Mao's Great Revolution, which inspires all of us to this day. So Mao's revolution was for liberation of the people of China. It was a second socialist revolution in the world, and it's equally important. But I think Kuomintang is not what Taiwan is today. from 80s on, they're both, here's the thing, both China, in my opinion, and Taiwan, both have capitalist mode of production, right? There's a difference between who rules in China. China is ruled by Communist Party. And so here is the classic question, in my opinion, is the national question. Is Taiwan a nation of its own or not? So if we are followers of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, we cannot ignore that question. Because the issue of socialism is liberation of human being. It is not about standard of living. It's not about what gives us the highest standard of living, but it is of human liberation from wage slavery, slavery of any kind. So socialists oppose claim of one nation over another nation on the basis that historically I owned you, or my imperial power owned you. So if Qing dynasty owned Taiwan for 200 years and Japanese owned it for 150 years, doesn't make it China, okay? So the question is, what makes it Chinese? Well, what makes it Chinese? I think you may say they're the Chinese-speaking Chinese people living there largely, although because Aboriginal people are very few in any case, and even if they are integrated. But I don't think the national question could be looked at simply because they're Chinese. They must be forced. So the first thing is you can't use force to integrate Taiwan into China. It has to be because the Taiwanese people want to be part of China. And they were attracted to it because Mao's liberation was in contrast to Chiang Kai-shek's brutality. You know, Mao's was a liberating thing, but that is not. So both situation in Taiwan and mainland China have changed. China, I think, is an authoritarian capitalism run by the Communist Party. We will examine that. Give me a few minutes, I'll examine what I think it is. I'm not simply going to say it's capitalist. I'm not going to say it's socialist for sure. So the national question of Taiwan is this: do the people of Taiwan form a nation? I think they do. They have 77 years of separate development, okay? They have their own culture. They were influenced by both the Dutch and the Spanish for some time, Japanese for another time. They are gone. But the cultural influences are there. They just like the United States is a European culture, but it's not Europe. It's its own culture, right? It's much longer. So does Taiwan. Okay, Taiwan also is a very successful economy, and it's run bourgeois democratic elections. Okay, now it's still a rule of capital, but that's what I think is happening in China. So the question is, do the people of Taiwanese want to join China or do they not? My understanding from what I've seen so far in the papers, from all the opinion surveys, I don't know if they're valid or not, you're not going to find even 10% of the people who want to be part of mainland China, PRC. Now, maybe David and others could tell me if that's not true, but I don't think they want to be. For one thing, their standard of living is higher. Both are successful. China and Taiwan are successful, but and Taiwan is tiny, 23 million people. China is 1.45 billion, right? But like India, China has so much of peasantry and poverty due to colonialism or semi-colonialism, they'll take a longer time. Taiwan, being a smaller population, much more integrated with Western capitalist or Japanese than Western capitalist economics, have a high level of development. It's more modernized and so forth. So I think the question becomes, does China have a right to kind of just arm wrestle it away and say, okay, well, historically it's my part? I don't think so. I think it has to be by Taiwanese agreeing to do it, and Chinese people, of course, Chinese people want it, like Indian people would want Pakistan to be part of India, but their right doesn't count. What counts is the people in Pakistan. Do they want to be part of India? And they don't. Okay, they have formed a different, distinct entity for about the same time Taiwan has. Okay, so that's the question. Now, then some comrades here feel, and I think David and Jean are among them, and Gary, that China is a socialist country. I don't think so. So so what does the CPC represent? Who it's certainly has a 95 million membership in its and it comes from the great history of the revolution. So it has legitimacy. It's a continuing from Mao's time, but party has changed, and so his system has changed. So who does the CPC represent? In my opinion, CPC represents not the capitalist class. I agree with that. It does not represent the proletarians, which is what a party is supposed to be. If you're a communist party, it has to be party of the proletarians. Who are the proletarians? They are the people who are the poorest of the working class. Okay. So now the Chinese Communist Party, the proletarian section is very small. Okay. Largely, it is the government workers and other people, higher level Chinese working class are the members, from what I understand it. Okay. Again, if you think that is not correct, you can correct me and tell me, why do you think it represents the proletarian class? Because 28% of Chinese working class lives on minimum wage. Okay. They may have some benefit, but not, it's above the minimum wage in India, but cost of living in China is also high. So anybody says the Chinese Communist Party represent the same party that Lenin led, no, or Mao led, no, it does not. So the thing is, but it also doesn't represent the capitalist class. So it is a kind of a party that is a party of the working class, but the working class that is accepted wage slavery in return for higher wages, okay? It has accepted rule of capitalism, okay? So there's the Chinese capitalists who exploit Chinese workers, get rich, and export capital out overseas, and that Chinese state supports that. So in that sense, it is a different kind of state, okay? It is not socialist, that can be said. Now, if that is not a socialist state, is it a syndicalist state? No, it is not a syndicalist state, because syndicalism is about unions that form a government and they run it, a capitalist system under union control. I think our friend Steve Zeltser, even though calls himself a communist and a Trotskyist, he's always talking workers' democracy. I think he's talking about that kind of a thing, syndicalism. So syndicalist state is a workers' union collectively, and it maintains capitalist mode of production. So you may say it is a collectively run capitalism that competes in the world with other forms of capitalist states. So the capitalist states that are, what are capitalist states? They are nothing other than a band of dominant capitalists of society, large ones, who suppress other classes, okay, and promote their collective welfare through, that is of their class, for their control on the state. They are, as is described, I forget, it's Marx or Lenin, the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, okay, big bourgeoisie. So China cannot be classified as a syndicalist state. It is not governed by Democratic Association of Unions, though it has capitalism. So what is it then? Okay, the Chinese system is below that stage of syndicalism. It is, and it has degraded there, in my opinion. It has, from Mao's time, it is degraded. Mao's time was a difficult time. I mean, it was a very poor country. Mao's programs had a lot of problems, the Great Leap Forward, all kinds of problems. I agree. So it is neither that nor a workers' union-run state. It's rather a party that represents what I would call the bribed upper layers of workers and government servants and those kind of people, and some capitalists are allowed to be in the party, though they don't run the state. So it is a distinct form, and I would call it is a dirigist form. Dirigisme is a French word, which means directive. So it directs capitalist development of China. So the question becomes, which class is generating a capitalist class? And 1941, it's not going to be a switch that Chairman Xu is going to make a switch, and then all of a sudden it'll become a worker, socialist state, pure and simple. So it is in this context that we're talking about what happens in Taiwan. The United States has, of course, no right to interfere, and it's an imperialist country. I'm absolutely against that. Against US bases in Taiwan, against creating incident that Nancy Pelosi's created. So the question is, that is why, I mean, this whole saber rattling that China did, throwing missiles, surrounding the island and all that, do you think that is going to endear it to the people of Taiwan? No, it's going to be, basically, China is saying we can completely crush you because you're 23 million. We're 66 times as big as you. But that's dominance. That's not socialism. We as Marxists are against the process of dominance, right? So how is it that you all of a sudden say, well, this is about peace in the world? No, no country should dominate another country. That includes China trying to dominate the people of Taiwan. People of Taiwan has to feel like they're part of China and join China. I have no problem with that. Nancy Pelosi, of course, fished in troubled water. But look at the reaction of Chinese Communist Party led by Xi Jinping. Oh, saber rattling, and you're going to burn if you play with fire and things like that. What is this? This is basically a display of imperial type of mindset, not that of a communist mindset. Okay, but if you look at the speech Xi Jinping, as party had gave at the 100th anniversary of the party's formation, right? It was, what did he say? I mean, I couldn't find a word working class or class struggle in there. It was all about Chinese nation, rejuvenation of Chinese nation. How is that got anything to do with socialism, folks? Tell me. It isn't. And so therefore, we as if you are really a socialist and a Marxist and a revolutionary one, you cannot come just simply say Taiwan belongs to China, get out, China, should be left alone and it'll be a friendly country. No, capitalism is never a friendly system because it needs to expand. It comes from the very basic mechanics of that Marx taught us. And if Marx, what it taught is irrelevant, what Lenin taught us is irrelevant, what Stalin taught us is irrelevant, then what kind of socialism do you believe in? So that's my argument against my two very dear friends here who are both Marxists. And I think they have revolutionary credentials, both of them. I mean, I know David has enormous revolutionary credentials, but I can't agree with this idea that the Taiwanese people have to submit to the will of the Communist Party of China. They have no more right than the United States people who are subjugated by the United States in rest of the world have to submit themselves. So that's my position on it. I'll give you one parallel here, just a little bit, and then finish. Pakistan and India separated in 1947. Okay, should India have the right to force Pakistan to be integrated with India? Right wing in India, from where Modi comes, harbor such views. They harbor such views. But no, by the same logic of liberation, that is Lenin Stalin's contribution to the national question, Pakistan, we cannot just simply say, well, whether you like to be with us or not, you used to be once upon with us, and our imperial domain extended there. And it is the British who came and divided and turned you into a vassal, to turn it into a separate country against us. No, that's not how the national question is dealt with by Marxists. And now there's a difference. Taiwan was never recognized by UN as an independent country. Pakistan was. Okay, even India recognizes Pakistan. So, as a sovereign country, economically, Pakistan is just above Sri Lanka in terms of failed state. Sri Lanka is essentially a failed state, is a failed state. Pakistan is right next to it. Now, unlike that, Taiwan is actually not a failed state. Okay, so it's national question of, so Pakistan actually qualifies more as a failed state and therefore a dependency. Taiwan isn't. So now, having said all that, US imperialism role has to be looked at. Okay, US of course wants to manipulate. I don't know what the motivation of Ms. Pelosi was. She basically was fishing in troubled water. She went there. She believes in all this kind of stuff about, she's a bourgeois feminist and an imperialist. So I think US has no right to interfere either. But this is the world we are living in. Powerful countries are dominating small countries. And if somebody can convince me that China will not be a dominating country as a capitalist country, please go ahead, do that. With that, I end my presentation. We discuss it further in the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Next, we'll have questions and comments, but before that, we have several announcements to make. Jean, maybe you could let us know, say a few words about our next forthcoming programs.
Yeah, I'm on. Yeah, we have some really good programs coming up. Next week, August 14th, the Mexico Solidarity Project and the continuing importance of the international working class solidarity, with our very own Ann Lewis is going to be speaking. And that's a very important one, I think. And I'm sure that'll be very good. And then August 21st, we're going to have Professor Gerald Horn, who's a professor of history at the University of Houston. And his latest book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of US Fascism. So that's what's coming up in the next few weeks. And I think it's going to be very good. And I'm looking forward to it. And I hope to see all of you there.
Thank you, Jean. I just want to make a comment about an announcement about finances. I'm going to put some information in the chat about how you can contribute to the work of ICSS. And there's all the similar information is on our website, icssmarks.org, and in your announcement, your email announcement you received a couple of days ago. So we do have expenses, and particularly as we move to a more complex technological platform, so give generously. But anyway, so now we're going to go to questions and answers and comments. I just want to say that last time we had a few problems towards the end, mostly because I got a little bit tired. But so I warn you, don't wait till the end to make your comments or questions. Don't try to have the last word. Jump right in. I already have some comrades who raised their hands. We'll take Keith first, followed by Sharon, Rose, and Michael Kosh. Go ahead, Keith. Unmute yourself. Are you able to unmute yourself, Keith?
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Right.
Well, first thing that, that I wanted to bring up is that China could actually embargo the island of Taiwan without even invading. They would not have to land a single soldier. And that you know, they're in a perfect position to do that militarily. They're 100 miles from Taiwan. And they could use their Navy and their Air Force to prevent any goods from leaving or entering. And one of the problems that we have is it's a geopolitical problem, because first of all, Taiwan has been used before as a staging ground, for instance, by the Japanese to invade China. This has been done before, and they don't want an American aircraft carrier off their coast. And you got, you know, I can understand that. We would not want China sending arms to Mexico. So it goes beyond just national sovereignty and, you know, national liberation. I understand, yeah, Taiwan could technically be called a separate nation at this point. It could be. Now, the other thing that I wanted to bring up is that, I mean, nobody has commented on this in the media yet, and I haven't heard it here, but right after Pelosi made her visit to Taiwan and, you know, made some speeches and, you know, met with some legislators, after she left, Zelensky pipes up from Ukraine, and he is trying to get China to pressure Russia to back off of their military operations in Ukraine. So I am wondering if that was the plan from the beginning, is to try to force a quid pro quo, where China gets to basically, things stay the same. Taiwan is still officially considered part of China, but you have to get the Russians to back off. So I'm wondering, if anybody has any comments on that. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Does any of our panelists have a contribution on that matter? Okay.
I think David wants to say some. David wants to say something on that. David wants.
I don't know that he wants to say something.
Oh, okay.
You have to unmute yourself, David, if you want to respond. Unmute yourself, Dave Ewing. You cannot? You're having difficulty?
I got it, finally.
Good.
Okay.
Good.
So I'd like to respond to Raj. Is that what you're asking me to respond to, Raj?
Either way.
Okay.
Can
Yeah, I'd like to respond to the left is in a difficult spot in this country and has been for some time. During the Cold War, the American government made it illegal for communists to be in trade unions. And so the whole left this created a divide between the communists and the working class. And the left has had a difficult time reorienting itself into the working class. And as a result, the left has moved very far to the right in the United States. And anti-communism permeates life in the United States, not only on the right, but also on the left. And so there is very little support for any socialist country in the world today. So I don't know, some people, Raj was wondering whether we should support the right of China to a divided China divided by imperialism, whether we would support the mainland if it tried to occupy Taiwan. I wonder what Raj would think about Korea. Are there two Koreas? Is there a separate Korean nation in the South? There's not one Korea. Standard of living is higher in South Korea than in North Korea. Would Raj support for the war between North and South Korea? Who would Raj support? Would he be neutral like he is on Taiwan? Perhaps so. But anti-communism, this kind of anti-communism is very persuasive. Of course, you would support every communist would support North Korea in a war against the South. And the same is true of when any socialist state like Cuba coming under attack. We would support Cuba against any imperialist aggressor. And even if people in Cuba have a lower living standard than people do in Miami, we still support Cuba because it represents the social relations of the future. It represents a working class role and the social relations of the future. Yes, the imperialists are able to isolate and punish countries that are socialist, but China is a much harder nut to crack. China is such a successful socialist country. It's actually a real threat to U.S. imperialism. And so in the imperialist countries, the left can be easily divided, pushed against, people feel the visceral threat, the danger from a competing, and the American left is very hostile to China. Now, Raj, his hostility is kind of limited. He's a Marxist. His hostility is kind of limited. He won't support China. He doesn't support, maybe he wouldn't support North Korea in a war against South Korea. Maybe he wouldn't support Cuba. I think he might support one of those. I don't really know. But in the U.S., the hostility is pretty deep to China. For example, I just want to talk about some of the left groups think. Progressive Labor Party, for example, they kind of agree with Raj that China is a capitalist country, but it's also a fascist country. So I wonder, they're not the only group that thinks it's some kind of that China is some kind of imperialist country. But some left groups have gone so far deep into the anti-communism that they think that communist countries are actually fascist countries. So that's Progressive Labor Party. Freedom Socialist Party, the group from located in Seattle. They're an important group on the left, I think. They're important in the women's movement, especially. So people who are doing work in the women's movement will run into them, and they're good. They fight for women's rights. They run a group called Radical Women in San Francisco. They, in their latest issue of their paper, they say that there are two great imperialist powers in the world, China and the USA. And they don't, of course, they're communists, right? So they don't support any imperialism. So, but there is a range. The left wing of the Democratic Party, all the Social Democrats, Bernie Sanders, they're all anti-communist and they're all anti-China. And so there is a very, I should have been prepared for this, but I'm always surprised. But among leftists I know, and you can't really talk about Taiwan or issues of China without anti-communism rearing its ugly head, because it always seems to do that. So the American left, there are very few organized socialist groups on the American left that support communism. There just aren't that many that support communism in other countries. For example, there was a counter-revolutionary demonstration in Cuba 6 months ago, and so the Freedom Socialist Party now, which had been a supporter of Cuban socialism, now says Cuba is no longer socialist. So we have people, it doesn't take much to antagonize the American left, I'm afraid, because the anti-communism runs so deep. So China is a socialist country, despite what Raj might think. The party controls industry, and China is becoming more socialist every day. There are more, for example, in most countries, in most of China now, many social services that Americans have to pay for are free, and more are becoming free. Transportation is becoming free in many places. Museums are open for free. Things are free. That's something that capitalism doesn't do. Capitalism privatizes social goods. China makes them public. So China's economy now is suffering because of COVID, but there has been a rising trend in standard of living. In an isolated place like Taiwan with an immense amount of US imperialist investment, Japanese investment, they can temporarily have a standard of living higher than China, but their standard of living is not rising. China's standard of living is rising. The Chinese workers' standard of living is rising all the time. The party controls, we see demonstrations of party power all the time in China. Every once in a while, they'll execute one of the big capitalists. That doesn't happen much. We execute workers in the US. Why does China execute capitalists? And why does the US execute workers? Maybe because there's a class difference in the nature of the state. The big companies like Alibaba, which run afoul of people that harm their workers or do something wrong, the government will suppress them. They'll do things to punish the very top leaders of those countries. When was the last time that people remember the leader of a big American oil company like Exxon getting executed or being punished? Maybe he should be served as Secretary of State instead, huh? So that just doesn't have, that kind of thing just doesn't happen in the U.S. China has been, China is developing socialism in the face of a fairly hostile world, a fairly hostile imperialist world. And the working class parties that should be China's allies in the international scene are largely anti-communist and hostile to China. So the American working class has a duty, of course, to defend the Chinese state and defend socialism and communism in China. But we have largely abandoned that duty. We have abandoned our internationalism. And, part of the whole collapse of the left and the rise of right-wing politics, not only in the US, but around the world, reflects that lack of international solidarity. It's a big loss for the working class worldwide. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next, we have on the list Sharon, Michael Kosh, Richard W., Mike G., and Janet. Raj, I'm going to leave you till the end, so that these, and then following, and then Prahan, New York, NY. So, and then Jean also will come up. So go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you. So thank you everyone who presented. I have a couple of three different reactions that I wanted to raise briefly. One is about the history of how Taiwan got to be what it is today. David, I was interested in what you said about the US diplomats and some part of the military having actually supported Mao in the civil war that emerged after the end of the Second World War, after the end of Japanese occupation. When I went to China, I learned that something I hadn't known before was that the Communist Party and Mao and Zhou Enlai offered Chiang some kind of a sharing of power, some kind of unity government, because they were trying to avoid the civil war that unfolded in 1946, because the Chinese people were exhausted. Millions had been displaced, and it was just having enough for all of people to eat was just enormously difficult in the wake of the Japanese, what the Japanese did to 1/3 of China. And so they offered a compromise, and which was refused. But I had always thought that, I have thought since I learned that it was the US telling their puppet, don't accept this, that made Chiang Kai-shek willing to fight the civil war, which he ultimately lost. Anyway, that's a question of history, which is interesting. But going on, I think it's really important when we're talking about the history of the US policy toward China and where we are today to understand the opening up that happened, that was led by Nixon and Kissinger, that changed everything in 1972. And why US capital wanted that and made it happen. And it was because of the cheap labor and the investment that they wanted, and the cheap labor of China that for production of cheap goods in China, and the exportation of some US industry to China. And that was very successful on the part of both the Chinese, and it served both the interests of the US and China. It has had played a big role in the development of China. And now, apparently, capital has decided to not have that policy any longer. And, Trump was elected, one of the main things he was elected on was bringing back jobs, our jobs. And that he didn't succeed very well. I mean, it was laughable what he tried to do. But now they're seriously, the Democrats have seriously taken that up. The whole thing about manufacturing chips in the United States is only the beginning. And people like Bernie Sanders and everybody to his right in the Democratic Party talk about our jobs and bringing jobs home and jobs being exported and blah blah blah. And so I think that's a huge decision on the part of U.S. capital as part of or related to or somehow an integral part of the whole thing that David emphasized, rightly so, that U.S. capital sees China as a great threat. And I know I'm going over time, but I also wanted to just say one other thing, which is that this thing about proletariat and working class, I think, Raj, you're using a semantic difference to make a political point. And, there are strata in the working class in China as well, of course, in the United States. So there's stratification. And if you want to use the word proletariat to describe or for the most oppressed strata, okay, that's fine. But what we need to talk about the entire working class as having power and contending for power, even though there are those contradictions among the strata. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to be more enforcing our time limit, which there's a number of people want to speak. So let's keep it to 2 minutes for each person. One point. Next one is Michael Kosh. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I thought this talk was supposed to be about why the U.S. Constitution protects the few instead of the many. So what happened, and are you ever going to have that talk?
I hope we will. Because we decided not to have hybrid sessions, it was not possible to have that previous session. So I hope we can have it in the future.
What did you decide not to have?
Well, I don't want to go into it now. I can talk to you later. But let's stick to the subject. It's technical more. It's not that interesting. Okay, the next one is Richard, right?
Yeah, I'll try to be really brief here. I know Raj and I have been getting into it on the chat, but question I had is there was a there was a policy of one China, two systems that we basically seem to have agreed to. On the other hand, we also tried to subvert it, through a lot of intelligence efforts. And I can't help but think that the same thing is applying to Taiwan, that the Chinese seem to have taken care of the Hong Kong issue, and now we're backed up and trying to meddle in Taiwan. I was just wondering if somebody could address that issue. Thank you.
Okay. Next is Mike G. Mike G. Please.
Yeah. Thanks very much for inviting me back. I haven't been on this platform for some time. I think about a year ago. I just want to make a couple of comments. I mean, as a classical Marxist, I mean, I'm always struck by just how little correspondence there is between what we actually see in the world described as communist and some of the indications of what communism should look like that have been written by Marx and Engels. neither of whom actually gave a specific sort of description of what communism should resemble. But what they hint at quite heavily is that it needs to be democratic, it needs to be bottom up. It doesn't need to be autocratic and top down. And my problem with countries like China and indeed the Bolsheviks and Soviet Russia is that the aspiration of being democratic very, very quickly evaporated once the party got power. In terms of China, I think China is a socialist country. It's an autocratic socialist country. Britain is a democratic socialist country. And I just wonder whether or not any of the speakers, and in particular, I think it's is it David, would like to comment on what role he sees democracy having, and in what way we can perhaps move towards encouraging democracy, albeit a bourgeois form of democracy, perhaps in its early stages, in countries like North Korea. Because for me, I think freedom for working people is equally as important as welfare and other rights.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go through all the speakers and then come back to our panelists at the end. Next is Janet Colbran, followed by Trahan. Go ahead, Janet.
Okay, so I thank everybody for your presentations. I have 3 questions. I'll be brief. I'll try to be brief. 2 for David and the other kind of to everyone. First, David, could you talk about the US debt China owns, I believe in US Treasury bonds, and what kind of tricks might the US play with it, like it did with Russia, and the financial tricks. The second is, can you also talk about the makeup of the Chinese American constituency in Nancy Pelosi's congressional district? And third, this is kind of a broad question. The US has something like 800 military bases in countries worldwide and has to fund those. The US has military involvement right now, albeit whether under the guise of NATO or proxy wars like in Ukraine and Syria and elsewhere, or in support of countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia against Palestinians and Yemenis, etc. Now the US is beefing up its support of Taiwan. This requires more and more military funding with US taxpayer money to finance military equipment, personnel, training, etc., away from funding domestic needs. How long can this go on? I mean, it's like just bankrupting the US economy.
Okay, thank you. And one more, Trahan, NY. Go ahead. And then we'll go back to the panel.
Yes, I always thought that the pivot to China by Obama, I was just kind of really angry about it because it was so confrontational, but that's what capitalists do. They just want confrontation and war. But I feel that if a socialist system does come into the United States, or where the Communist parties in power, that the Chinese model would be the most successful, because many of the companies, the products you have in China are here. You're going to have less resistance. A Soviet model would be more difficult. So I think if there was a party comes into power, the Chinese model would be much more successful here. And also, it's I'm very impressed the way China has been able to massively industrialize the infrastructure, just like these bullet trains. Just amazing what they're doing. But here in the United States, it's just gridlock with the capitalists. It's just gridlock. You can't get anything done. And so that's my comment.
Thank you. Somebody asked how to raise your hand. You go down to the bottom of the screen, you move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, and you go to reactions, as I recall, and there you can click on the button, raise your hand if you want to speak or ask a question. Well, if any of the panelists want to, and there it is, Kathleen Densmore will be the next person. Go ahead, Kathleen, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to say two short things. One is, I don't think you're anti-communist just because you don't consider China socialist. And second, I don't think it's appropriate to be implying that anyone here is anti-communist. Just see that as inappropriate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to open up to the panelists. I think they all have their hands up, or at least did recently. I'll call on Raj first, followed by David, and I think Gene maybe took his hand down. Go ahead, Raj.
Thank you. So I strongly disagree with David's assertion this communism, as Kathleen said, if you don't consider China as socialist. China is a capitalist. The underlying economy of China is capitalist. Okay, so it's run by a party, and then you say, because it's run by a party, it's socialist. Well, that's your definition of socialist. That's not Marx, Lenin, or Stalin's definition. Okay, those are the builders, or nor Mao's. Okay, for that matter. So therefore, I think the problem is if you commit yourself, I'm just completely committed. If you're not committed, you're just nobody. Okay, you can only be an anti-communist. No, this is not true. About executing capitalists, well, individual capitalists may be executed in China, but not for capitalism. That's because they're crossing some other line, okay? Not for being capitalist. Okay, the whole system is capitalist in China. Okay, the distinction is run by a communist party which has a history of revolution. So it's a very peculiar situation, no question about it. Now, I want to respond to this working class versus proletariat, okay? Now, Sharon raised this, okay, working class as a whole, it's what matters, it runs it. No, the working class here in the United States also, in a way, was controlling the state when the Democratic Party had a large number of working class people with their unions supporting and going. When I came here, they were very, very strong. So you can have that. It is not the working class. Proletarians, that's why you have to read Lenin, and my reading of Lenin, which I'm sure all my Marxist friends here have read. Proletariats are the ones that form the party because for them, their back is to the wall. They are the only one who can be relied on keeping to the target of building socialism. And if socialism is capitalism, you're confusing the whole thing. Don't call capitalism socialism, okay? You can say they took a digression, they will come back. If you can defend a 50-year-long digression, 60-year-long digression to come back, you will have, the onus is on you, not on me. To me, China is developing along the capitalist path run by a communist party. The fact it hasn't expanded and attacked there are European countries that have not attacked others because it fitted well into the interest of United States capitalists by having profits both ways. So in fact, Soviet Union's collapse came because of China's integration. The two came together, but China was toying with this thing already, and Soviet Union was having difficulty with this system. So I don't think that's fair. Proletariat has to be the leader within the working class, and in China, that is no longer the case. That is why I'm saying it is a revisionist, much more than a revisionist. It's a capitalist system there. Okay,
thank you.
right, one sec, two more quick comments. Right, one China, two systems, we agreed to. Well, you may agree to anything, but the point is, what is just, what is correct as a Marxist? Is it correct to hand over the Taiwanese people to the control of China, even if they don't want to? I don't think so. I think the rest is Mike G's other thing. Others can comment. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. David, you had your hand up. I don't, oh, Gene had a hand. Oh, whatever. David, go ahead.
That person NY had their hand up, says that it's been taken down.
Go ahead, David.
NY.
He spoke.
Oh, I don't know what their name is then.
Please, we got it. Okay, who wants to?
Janet asked a question about the T-bills and the U.S. debt owned by China. I don't think, I mean, there is, the problem for China is that they run a trade surplus with the U.S. And so, the U.S. People buy Chinese goods with dollars. And so the Chinese companies had to figure out what to do with those dollars. So what they've been doing is they've been buying U.S. Treasury debt. It's a logical, commercial way to handle that kind of a problem. I think, though, we've seen that recently in the retaliation by the U.S. against other countries, that, for example, Afghanistan, Russia recently, the U.S. orders the banks to steal your bank account. So I think China's backing away a little bit. The problem is they own so many dollars that they would collapse the markets if they pulled it all out, and they would be hurt too. I think so. It's a commercial decision that Chinese companies have to make, I think. But I think generally we've been through a difficult period where you've seen the U.S. Economic reprisals against any country that dare raises its hand against U.S. imperialism. So I think probably I think the trend has been for China to reduce its holding in dollars and switch into other currencies when they have to. So that I just wanted to mention that. Another question. I want to mention this thing about the anti-communism. It's important that people recognize that anti-communism can take a left form as well as a right form. So, for example, during the Vietnam War, I think that all American communists had a duty to support Vietnam in that war. Now, maybe people from the left argued that, oh, the Vietnamese Workers' Party is very repressive. We can't support North Vietnam. My God, look how they repressed the Trotskyites in the 1940s. It's a repressive regime. There are elections in South Vietnam, and many people on the left, not as many as now, but many people on the left would not support the North. They may have been against the war to some degree, or they didn't support the fascists running the Saigon puppet regime, but they were not for the North. So that to me is an abandonment of proletarian internationalism when you refuse to support working class and international struggles against imperialism. I think most people, even if they are hostile to China, they'll recognize that at least during the time of the Vietnam War, and perhaps even during the Korean War, we have the duty of every American communist, especially American communists, when it's the U.S. that's leading the war against the Koreas, that it was a duty of every American communist to do that. More today, it's just as important. The U.S. is the imperialist power trying to destroy communism in China. If they are successful, people who have this left-wing criticism of China will find that socialism will vanish from the world. The strongest, most powerful socialist state, the one that promotes communism around the world, is China. If we lose China, if the Chinese Communist Party fails and is defeated by U.S. imperialism, we'll continue in this very dark period, and it will be deeper. I think the greatest defeat for communism recently was the failure of the Soviet Union. That was a world historic defeat that affected the thinking of working people and their enemies around the world, and has for decades to come, has crippled the working class movement. If China goes, we will lose it all. And it's absolutely essential from the perspective of if people want to criticize China from the left, there are many people, most of the so-called socialists in this country do criticize China from the left, and they're going to support it. But we cannot be ambiguous or agnostic in a battle between the United States and Chinese socialism. We cannot be agnostic in that battle. Just like in the Vietnam War, people who were agnostic about the war, oh well, I don't support the U.S. of course, but I can't support the repressive North Vietnamese. No. People like that, they are act as though they are a political reserve of U.S. imperialism. A political reserve of imperialism, because they prevent the working class in this country from organizing to resist the war, to fight against it, to support the socialist country. People today who criticize China from the left, saying it's not socialist or something, or create an inequality between repression. Oh, it's very repressive in China, just like the US. There's really no difference. They're both imperial. People like that are a very important, powerful political reserve of US imperialism that the Democratic Party can call on for a Nancy Pelosi visit, and more aggressive actions against China too. So it's important that recognize the political impact of all the anti-communism is to create a very powerful political, not just economic, a real political reserve right in the workers' movement against communism. And that's why it's so dangerous to be agnostic about the confrontation between US and China over Taiwan. Thank you.
I just want to raise the issue which we had in the original topic, was the relationship of the visit of Nancy Pelosi to China and the crisis of the Democratic Party. And I'm not going to say very much about it, but it's pretty clear that the more the Democratic Party is doubling down on aggression and the militarism, and part of it's as a response to its own crisis. Nancy Pelosi didn't just go to Taiwan; she went to Ukraine to support the regime there, the puppet regime in Kiev, and so I'm not so. I'll leave it right there. Jean, you had your hand up, followed by NY, followed by Mike G.
Yeah, yes, I did, and thank you, and I really appreciate.
And please keep it brief. We're coming to we don't have a lot of time.
Yes,
left.
I will be as brief as possible, and I'll just check and see. But I appreciate David's comments because he expresses many of my ideas better than I can. But I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, that when we look at nations, at countries like China, Cuba, and others, even the Soviet Union, we have to look at them in Marxist terms. And what Marx would have said about these is clear from his critique of the Gotha program, where he said, after the revolution, you don't have a perfect society. You have a society that is just struggling to emerge from a century embedded in a hostile capitalist world. So, and if we had a world of nations like China, the old Soviet Union, Vietnam, Cuba, we wouldn't have any wars. We wouldn't have poverty, wouldn't have global warming, all the problems that we have, we would not have if we had nations like these socialist countries. And I agree also with David when he says that, the biggest catastrophe on the left was the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991. And the very day that, Solidarity won an election in Poland, and this was the start of the whole unraveling of the Soviet Union. While this was going on, China dealt with its imperialists and the so-called democracy movement, the pro imperialist students, so sometimes called the Tiananmen incident or the Battle of Beijing. But they reacted to that favorably, put that down, and now they are continuing to lead the world in a peaceful direction. So basically, yes, I support the Communist Party of China. Xi Jinping is doing a great job. I may not understand all that he's doing and the Communist Party is doing, but I'm not a backseat driver. They're taking us where we need to go. Thank you.
Next is NY.
Okay, thank you for, I raised the wrong hand before. I just want to, I think I agree with the Keith. There should be some discussion about so-called national or nationalist versus class struggle. I think China, as most of the third world countries before, emerged from, although it's raised the flag of Marxist, but it basically emerged from the older colonialism. Those countries like Vietnam, Korean, whatever, they raised from the former colonialist. And so their goal, actually Marxist was adopted by Mao. And I believe sincerely too, because there's no other way. It's a way out. How can we save China at that time under the imperialist and the so-called, it's not really capitalist, but foreign capital, whatever. And so and then they find Marxism is really help them to mobilize the peasantry at that time to fight against both enemies, outside, inside. And after that, Mao implemented a so-called real pure called socialism. But then the China didn't really get rich at all. And eventually China opened up. And even Marx considered that the country have to at least introduce some capitalists to get rich, to raise your standard of living before you convert to some socialist measures. And I think China realized that they need to develop their economy. And after the more purist socialist, they need to develop, and they need to break the blockade of West at that time for the economic sanctions to develop the economy. And they need to introduce, to do that, they need to introduce the capitalist mode of production. And in terms of whether China is a socialist or not, I think that it's kind of too empty to say, like Raj said. I wonder how much he know detail about the Communist Party, who constitute Communist Party, who is in control, how it works, whether it's supported like US, other capital, like basically depend on the capitalist money to run the country, was controlled by the capitalist interest, or not. And I agree that the communists in China right now don't say proletarian, because you want to raise like is Karen or that lady said, it's basically it's more national, like all level of society. We want to raise the standard of living for all Chinese. Basically that's it. And then they think it's necessary to introduce capitalist mode of production, especially in the overall capitalist international environment. And another thing I want to raise is, I think it's Raj thinking that, seemed to me that since China is not a socialist country, we shouldn't support China for its sovereignty integrity. Sovereign integrity. I think it's very odd to say that. If China is not, then this is a very important issue. On one hand is the sovereign rights of a nation. On the other hand is the class right, the proletarian or working class right. And these two do conflict sometimes each other. I cannot sort that out. But I think it is concluded too that because China is not socialist, so it doesn't have a right to do some certain things. I think it needs to be discussed. And third, I think Raj doesn't really understand detail about how the Taiwan come to be. Do you know why the Taiwan's constitution still consider itself part of China? He thinks it's own not only Taiwan, but it own mainland China. So it's always part of China. Of course, right now people can like exactly. I go back to human rights versus sovereignty, and the U.S. try to alternate using these two values, which are enshrined in the UN Charter, to use alternatively to serve its own purpose. On the one hand, it's okay. Regarding Ukraine, we should respect sovereignty. And regarding the former Yugoslavia, we should respect the self-determination, whatever, that kind of thing. Okay. So it is very interesting. Well, okay. I don't have. And the last word I need to say that is the Pakistan versus India. I think India and Pakistan is formally severed. And like I said, China and Taiwan never formally severed. And even in the Shanghai Communique, US and Sino-Shanghai Communique, the US explicitly says Taiwan is part of China and is recognized by all the nations, and almost all the nations, except like 13 nations that still recognize Taiwan. So it's different countries, different level.
Okay. Thank you. Next, Nina Wax, and then the last one will be Mike G, and then we'll end the recording. Please make it brief. Thank you. Nina Wax, go ahead.
I wanted to say that I was observing what Eugene said, and I thought I'd respond. I think he said something like, I don't totally understand what's going on in China, but I let them lead and I follow, and I did hear those words. So that's why I have a difference, because I do believe that when we're in an organization, we need to understand every minute of what's going on, and we really shouldn't just follow.
Nina, we have a hard time understanding. The sound quality on your device is very.
Let's cut off. Alan, let's go to another person while Nina. Correct.
Thank you, Nina. We're now go on Mike G.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I just want to make an observation. I mean, the democracy that we have in the West is in no way perfect. Marx would describe it as bourgeois parliamentary type democracy, bourgeois democracy in that it represents, and the structures it operates within represent the interests of the ruling class. So I'm not going to go and sort of wholeheartedly 100% defend the democracy that we have in the West. However, what's clear in the debate that we've been having is whether or not China is or is not a socialist country, it is absolutely not a democracy. One of the things that Marxism is very, and Marx himself and Engels are very clear on, is that the working class have the control of the state. The state eventually withers away, leaving the control of the country, the nationality, the globe, to the working classes who produce the surplus value, lowering time involved in work and increasing increasing the quality of the lifestyle that those people enjoy. In China, we don't have a country that's got any pretense of becoming a democracy. When it was allowed into the World Trade Organization at the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s, I think the expectation was that by exposing it to international markets and to the discipline of the capitalist system, the US in particular naively thought that this would trigger some kind of move towards a more democratic China. Where that has actually taken place is in Taiwan. I think, you know, for me, I don't want to be a sort of a poor cold water on ideas, but I really struggle to see how we can justify China being anything other than an undemocratic, autocratic state that doesn't really work for the benefit of its working classes.
Okay, thank you. And that sort of brings to the end of our formal program. I'll end the recording now. But we will continue for those who want to a more informal discussion. But still
Richard,
try and keep things limited. Keep
Richard,
your
I just
comments-
wanted to quickly respond to
Yeah. You can
previous
respond.
person who
You can
said
respond.
something.
Raj, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
Hold on a minute. We're going to end the recording now, and then there will be open discussion. Alan, have you ended the recording?
Well, I have a
Okay,
point
go
on
ahead,
that.
Raj.
I just
And
wanted
then
to
Norma.
respond quickly and then end the recording, okay? So what I'm saying is that somebody said about Taiwan was agreed as one nation. The one nation thing about one country thing is both sides, the Republic of China and Mao's China, both believe they should rule. That's where it comes from. And I think it has to be Taiwanese people and Chinese people have to accept each other. That's the point.
Yeah.
And that is the basis of national question resolution in Marxism. Just saying it is a imperialism versus socialism fight is you're hiding from that. That's it. My response.
Someday we'll get we'll get the labels right, Raj. In the meantime, the idea of for goodness sake, that's it. I'll be back.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.